The residential purchase agreement is, again, you have two documents in front of you, one marked sample and one marked the guide. The guide is designed for you to take back to your offices and share with your agents. We've done something different with this form change. Rather than just kind of announcing it and saying surprise, or having you find out from your agents, we're instructing all of the brokers what the changes are. We're giving you the tools then to go back to your offices and be the source of information to your agents, okay? So we really wanted to empower you in this. The reason why the RPA says sample is it will not be available for use until October 1st. So we're giving you about 30 days to train your agents, answer questions, and address all those things. The Forms Committee has decided, and the board has agreed with them, to release new forms twice a year on October 1st and, October 1st and April 1st. This was done, one, for your sanity, so you would know when new forms are coming. Now, if there's an emergency, if a court decision makes us change something, that's separate. But regular updates will come twice a year, April 1st and October 1st. The reason we like October 1st is when the legislature makes changes to Nevada law, those changes go into effect on October 1st. So if we have to change anything, for example, next year with the legislative session, you'll be ready for those changes. The other thing I would tell you just from the very beginning is really read through this document. It's not so much an update as almost a revision. Sections have changed. Things have been moved. The flow of the document is improved. You'll notice that the current RPA, the one you have in front of you, is less than 10 pages. Your current RPA is 12 pages. I like to joke that this is how you can tell I am an employee of the association rather than an outside paid attorney, because no hourly attorney would ever submit a document that was 2 pages shorter. I also have a 13-year-old daughter. I'm going to get all my cheesy jokes done first, so here they go. I have a 13-year-old daughter. She loves Harry Potter. If you're Harry Potter fans, look at the back, the last page. This document is actually 9 3/4, so I like to joke it's your Harry Potter RPA. So I've got all my bad jokes, so we can move on now. So flow. One of the things we did is we wanted to make sure that we provided you a purchase agreement that you could convey and share with your clients that mirrors your presentations. In your current document, you actually tell the buyer or the seller that the airport is noisy before you explain what due diligence is. So what we did as a part of this, I mean, there's some sections that were updated for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into shortly. But the other idea was to create a document that, again, you could really share with your clients and explain in a logical fashion. So to facilitate that, we got a small group of practitioners, some very tech savvy, some not so much, young, inexperienced realtors, folks with years and years of experience. And we came and we sat down and we had our art department blow up every section of the RPA to about 12 by 18 on a big piece of poster board. We spread them out in the boardroom right over here, and we actually asked the people to move the sections in a way that would explain them. So if you'll notice, the due diligence provision has been bumped up. Inspections have been changed. The CIC section has been moved. So really take time to look at this document and be familiar with it. The other thing I would tell you, the one thing to take away from this to share with your agents is that due dates matter. They've always mattered, but in this document they matter more. And so to be mindful of how you select those due dates and how you're calculating those dates. So if you've got software that does that as a brokerage, you know, you're ahead of the game on this, but be mindful of those dates. So we will also be talking about 2 separate documents at the end. So we have the new RPA as a part of this. The escrow instructions have been, or excuse me, the receipt of earnest money deposit has been spun off onto a separate document. We'll talk about that. And we've also updated what was called the buyer's response to the homeowner inspection, which I'll be honest, always confused me, because part of me wanted to say, if it's the buyer's response, does that mean they're anxious, happy, excited? It's really a request for repair. So we'll talk about that as well. But this document, the RPA, a lot of changes. That's where most of your questions are going to come. These 2 documents at the end, probably not so much. So let's jump into page 1. The first thing you'll want to take a look at is under 1A. We're starting at line 14. Nevada law requires earnest money to be deposited within 1 business day. or unless the parties agree otherwise. Since a majority of transactions now have just wiring the funds directly, we put that language in your RPA so you don't have to rewrite it. So that's there. The other thing that we've identified is the definition of the word acceptance. Your contract defines it. Section 23 is your definition section, where all the defined terms of your contract are. I can tell you that I get regular calls from people asking me when the contract actually starts. When do you start calculating these due dates? So to alleviate that, we reference it right on the first page. So we're going to jump to section 23. It's the bottom of page 7, line 49 through 51. Acceptance means the date that both parties have consented to a final binding contract by affixing their signatures to this agreement, and all counteroffers and said agreement and all counteroffers have been delivered to both parties pursuant to Section 24. Section 24 is your service provision. So basically, what acceptance means is it's the date that both parties get copies of the executed document. Okay? Are we clear on that? So that means, hypothetically, that if one party signs, so the buyer signs the counteroffer, sends it to their agent today at 1 o'clock, and sends it to their agent, buyer's agent then emails it tonight at 12:05 to the seller's agent, that's when you've got, so your date to start triggering would be from tomorrow. So you'll need to be mindful of that. What I recommend to people do, and we'll talk about calculations of dates in a minute, if you're concerned about the fact that acceptance now is actually that date, so potentially it could be, say the seller's agent emails you at 11:59 tonight, today's your day. That's when it starts. If you're concerned about that, you may want to build an extra couple of days into this section, be it the due diligence provision, the appraisal provision, whatever you're doing, just so that you give yourself some extra time. Okay? Any questions about that before we move on? Or have I put you all to sleep yet? Fantastic. Okay, 1C. We took out the language about specifics about interest rates and things like that under new loans. The reason why we did that is because of the efforts of our good friends at the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. You may or may not have that information when you're submitting an offer. So rather than having you just kind of guess or estimate or come up with something, we just simply took it out. Okay? Now let's go to the section, next page, sections 2B and 2C, the appraisal and the loan contingency. There were 3 major changes to the contract that you really needed to be aware of. 2B and 2C are number 2 and number 3. I expect to spend a lot of time talking about this right now. So if you've got questions, get ready. If you want to tell me this is a bad idea, again, wait till afterwards so we can talk about that. So the language in both of the contingencies is tried to be mirrored as quickly as possible. The purpose of the appraisal contingency was to encourage lenders to actually conduct the appraisals quickly. I get routinely people asking me to put language in the contract, going to the forms committee and asking the forms committee to put language in the contract that will force the lender to conduct the appraisal and move the process along. I've thought about it. The lender is not a party to the contract. They're not in contractual privity. They're not a third-party beneficiary of the contract. So the language here is designed to have the buyer's agent have an intelligent conversation with the buyer's lender and get a realistic number of how long that time is going to take to conduct the appraisal. And then, if that date is coming up, say if it was tomorrow and you haven't had an appraisal, the buyer will be able to communicate that to the lender. Hey, my appraisal due date is tomorrow. You told me you could do it by this time. You need to get this done. Now, please note that this section doesn't say that the buyer is going to lose their earnest money if the loan appraisal comes back, it's low, and the parties can't renegotiate. What it does is it doesn't guarantee it. So it creates the potential that the buyer may have a problem if they can't get the contract done past the appraisal. It's designed to put some skin in the game for the buyer, then can go to the lender and say, look, if we go past this contingency date, and you haven't conducted the appraisal and it comes back and I lose my earnest money, I have been damaged by your actions. And so it gives that leverage that you've been asking for, basically really the only way we could do it in the contract. Now lot of very passionate people have talked about this earlier this morning, last week. I'm waiting for the hands to go flying. So let me tell you what the main purpose behind this is, because I think there's a lot of heartburn here when there doesn't necessarily need to be. The purpose of the residential purchase agreement is to get a buyer and seller to a successful real estate transaction, or get them out of this unsuccessful transaction as quickly as possible. So putting in this due date helps you speed that process along. If you're going to sooner, if the appraisal comes back and it's below the list price, you're going to have that discussion sooner or later with the buyer what they want to do. The idea behind this was to speed that up so that the process could move forward. The loan contingency is the same language as well. It was designed to make this as mirrored as possible. So the question, so you need to be having an intelligent, if you're the buyer's agent, and I'll be honest, if you're a buyer's agent, this purchase agreement puts a lot more burden on you. There's a lot more stuff to do. You don't get to be passive in the real estate transaction with this purchase agreement. You need to be active. Now we'll talk about how that is actually helping you in a second, but before I'm going to go hide behind the podium, and then I'm going to ask for questions. Anybody have any questions on this? Yes, sir.
In that case, nothing prevents us from adding maybe an addendum to this particular section by mentioning that should there be an issue past the due diligence period, the EMD becomes...
It actually doesn't preclude you from doing anything like that. This provision also says, look, by the end of this time period, let's say it's tomorrow, the buyer would need to either agree, waive the contingency, and they may lose their earnest money, cancel the deal, right, or renegotiate. So you have all of those options. So your situation about talking about, look, if we'll want to extend it, you want to make the earnest money hard and all that fun stuff, you have every right to do that, okay? It doesn't take any of those rights away. Anybody else?
As long as it doesn't put the EMD at risk, because
No.
buyers are always...
Well, that was something that you're going to need to have a conversation with your buyer when that due date is coming up. What do you want to do? And the irony about that is, of course, you're doing that and you're putting it in writing because you're protecting yourself, because your favorite client could be your least favorite opposing party in a courtroom very, very soon. You're putting all this stuff in writing, right? And so what I'm doing, what's your name?
Serge Michael.
I'm sorry?
Serge Michael.
Serge Michael. Okay, Serge Michael. So what I'm doing is you're sending me the email to me as your buyer. Dave, we don't know if the appraisals come back yet. The due date is this day. Here are your options. What do you want to do? You're sending that email because that protects you and you're zealously defending or representing your client and you're doing your job as a realtor. I'm out going to all the parties I'm going to on Labor Day weekend, and I'm telling all my friends about my awesome realtor who's out there actively protecting my interests. So it's marketing for you. I'm telling all my buddies that you're a phenomenal realtor, making sure that I don't miss anything, and you're also protecting yourself at the same time. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Hold on. Can we wait for the microphone, if you please?
So with VA taking 10 plus days, would it make better sense to say that the lender has to order it by a specific date?
Well, we thought about ordered, but the problem with ordering it is the lender is not a party to the contract, so how can we require them to do it? It has to be something that the parties to the contract can actually be enforced. Now, the reason why there's a blank there is exactly for VA or whatever. You as the buyer's agent are going to have a better idea of whatever this time frame is. Now, if I'm a lawyer, we always ask for the most amount of time possible. That may not be the best thing. That number right now might be 21 days, 60 days, whatever that number is, and it may change in 2 or 3 months. Now, if I'm a buyer's agent, I probably shouldn't put 6 hours in there. That would probably be a bad idea. But also at the same time, if I'm a buyer's agent and I put 963 days, that may not be good either. So the fact that you're asking the question, what do we do with VA, what do we do with these others, that means that you're already kind of in tune with the market and you have a general idea of what this number should be. Now, again, if a buyer and a seller want to complete a real estate transaction and you need a few more days, it's not going to be a problem. You'll just send out an addendum and say, hey, it's a VA loan, this is when we think it can get done, and you agree. If the buyer really doesn't want to buy, or if the seller really doesn't want to sell, rather than maybe potentially having this contingency out there till the very end of the transaction when the buyer says, oh, my appraisal came in 3 days before, it's under market, I'm out, and the seller has just been kind of drug along all the way, the due date allows this to kind of make that split quicker. Because again, the purpose of this is to get to a successful real estate transaction. If we can't, then to get them out of the way. Anybody else?
So I guess I'm confused.
Okay.
If the appraisal does not come back from the lender within the calendar days that we have set, and the parties aren't extremely eager to continue, which then we do an addendum, how do we, what happens if the appraisal doesn't come back within the stated date?
Okay. Well, so does everybody hear a question? Okay. So what happens if the appraisal doesn't come in? So if our appraisal contingency due date was yesterday, and the appraisal comes back today, and it's underpriced, what can we do? Okay. Well, what would you normally do in that scenario? You'd go to the buyer and say, what do you want to do? Do you want to see if we can renegotiate the price? Do you want to walk away? What do you want to do? That is exactly the same scenario. Now, whether the question of whether or not they will be entitled to get their earnest money back, that's the different issue. There's not an automatic right to get that back. And does that make sense? So it may or may not be. It's going to be an issue that when we talk about the mediation provision, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that'll become more important in a second. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the buyer is automatically entitled to their earnest money back if they blow this contingency, okay? But how you handle an underappraised appraisal doesn't change, okay? Now, one thing I wanted to talk about, because it's here and it's been an issue that everyone is bringing up, is the bolded language, is the language in the agreement that talks about that, it's on line 9 under 2B, whereupon the EMD shall be released to the buyer without the requirement of written authorization from the seller. And then I get this following question. Well, what happens with the escrow? Why isn't the escrow company doing this? Or how did you dare add this information to the RPA when escrow doesn't do it? So the first answer is language similar to this exists in at least 3 places in your current RPA. The second thing is, and I used to be a title attorney, represented title companies. I also represented Freddie, Fannie, Bank of America, the FDIC. I've been practicing law in Nevada for 15 years. And the reason why the title companies don't release the funds has nothing to do with the language in the contract. It has everything to do with them trying to not get sued. So with that in mind, what is, or who is the final audience of the residential purchase agreement? Sorry? The courts, nice and loud, the judge. Because an earnest money dispute is a breach of contract lawsuit, right? So the judge is the final audience. Now, judges, courts are guided by a concept known as the four corners concept, four corners doctrine. Breach of contract cases, they're bound by whatever's in the four corners of the contract. So the first thing the judge is going to ask is, what were the parties' intent when there's a breach, and what does the parties intend to do with the earnest money? So that's why the language has to be in your contract, because we want to tell the judge that in this scenario, the buyer is entitled to it, regardless of whether the seller turns it over or not. We want to tell the judge. And the reason why we want to tell the judge is courts decide 2 different types of issues. And this is my law school speech for the day, and then we'll move on. Questions of law, what is murder 1 versus manslaughter? Or questions of fact, was the light green or was the light red? Contracts, this issue is a question of fact. Now there's a concept known as a motion for summary judgment. Anybody familiar with that? Okay, it's a way to, because questions of fact are typically decided by a jury, okay? So a motion for summary judgment is a vehicle that I, as your attorney, can go into the judge and say, Judge, we don't need to go all the way to a jury because there are no genuine issues of material fact here. There's only issues of law. So in this case, Judge, there is no issue of fact here. The buyer is entitled to the earnest money. So the only thing you need to decide, Judge, is whether or not under the laws of Nevada, this contract was breached. Okay? So that's why the language is there. Now, so why doesn't the title companies follow that? Why don't they do that? Well, that's because they don't want to get sued, okay? And, you know, barring a massive transition of the American judicial system, you know, you know, I don't know how to fix that. So, but I would tell you that having the title company hold the money is actually beneficial to you and your clients, because they'll hold it until either the parties agree or a judge tells them what to do with it, right? What you don't want them to do is start getting into the practice of what's called interpleading the funds. Does anybody know what interpleading means? Okay. Interpleading means, and we used to do this a lot when I represented banks and we would foreclose on houses with equity. What do we do with the money that's left over? So interpleading the funds is where a party who holds funds, in this case the title company, goes to a judge and says, Judge, we don't know whose money this is supposed to be. Here are the people we think are interested. We've noticed them. And they'll need to come down here before you, judge, and fight it out. The problem with interpleading is, pursuant to Nevada statute, the title company in our scenario can take their attorney's fees and costs right off the top, and you don't get to fight over it. You don't even get to question it. So your client's $10,000 earnest money deposit is now $1,800.62.33, right? So you don't really want them to do that. So I kind of like the fact that they're holding it because of that issue. So again, so the idea is the language needs to be there so that the judge, we tell the judge how we want the funds dispersed, not necessarily from title. I can tell you that the Forms Committee is looking at creating a close-up escrow earnest money deposit form. We're going to meet with the major title companies in the Valley and see if we can create some language that would maybe alleviate this from them. Whether or not we'll be successful, I don't know. But we're going to be reaching out to the title companies and their attorneys to see if we can put some language together like other states do and maybe resolve some of these earnest money disputes short of litigation and or mediation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, any other questions about the loan, contingency, or appraisal? You guys have been remarkably, so I'm going to say it's one of two things. One, you're either ready for the weekend, or two, you're so much savvier than the other folks that there's no issues. Yes, ma'am. The title company, whoever has, okay, so the question was who does the interpleading? And the answer is whoever has the money. Okay, so if it's title company would do it, like for example, if you do a foreclosure on behalf of a bank and the loan was $300,000 and it went at auction for $350,000, the bank would interplead those funds. So it's whoever who holds it, okay? Now I can tell you in other states, for example, in Rhode Island, where they don't allow them to interplead it to the funds, to the courthouse, they require them to turn the funds over to the State Department of Taxation, which apparently takes them years to get through, like unclaimed property. So no one has earnest money disputes in Rhode Island because no one wants it to go to the government. Okay, so let's move on.
On that note,
sorry, yes?
What is, like, in a short version of it, as far as eliminating problems, can you give us some pointers to say pay attention to this and that? Obviously timelines are
sure.
So if you give us a specific guideline and say eliminate confusion.
So what I would tell you to do on 2B and 2C is, if I'm a buyer's agent, I'm going to have an intelligent conversation with the lenders I work with and make sure they understand that we need real dates. You know, because a lot of times I think some lenders will say, yep, we can get an appraisal done in 3 days. And that's never going to happen. So you need to have an intelligent conversation. As a seller's agent, I would be looking at this number to be realistic. I wouldn't be one of those that I would say they offered 21 days, I'm going to counter with 20 just to win. I would be looking at, hey, is 21 days a realistic time period to get the transaction done? So that's what I would tell you in 2B and 2C. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say that actually this is an excellent contingency to be placed in the contract, having closed about 40 in the last 7 months. Because the new TRID laws require the lenders to be upfront now for everything. So what I've seen is I've seen more expedient appraisal. I've seen them be more aggressive, and it is for our benefit. Yeah. Because then you're not wasting time, your time and the buyer and the seller's time on the market. So it's holding us accountable, but it has worked. It's not causing any more undue work because the lender's pushing it as well. So I just wanted to bring that to the attention after having done several closings.
Thank you. As a side note, we pulled this language when we started looking at changing our RPA. I went and got a copy and read every single residential purchase agreement in use west of the Mississippi. Yes, I know I need a hobby, but if you ever want to come down to my office, we can look through them together. And this type of language is pretty common, okay? So it's not, it's not that we're being, not necessarily not being innovative, but this is stuff that's out there. So if you practice in other states, you're probably seeing language similar to this here, okay? So any other questions about 2B and 2C before we move on to section 4? The fixture section. Not a whole lot of change in the fixture section. We did add a little bit about ranges and stoves and things like that, so make sure you look through the fixture section, but not a major change there. Let's now go to the next page, page 3. This came, yes ma'am. That's okay.
Solar power systems?
Yes.
So is that included if I have like solar power on my roof? But then
Yeah.
it also says free of liens.
Yeah, so you have a very good question about solar panels alone. So solar panels technically are a fixture, and so they would arguably be conveyed, and they would need to be conveyed free of liens. And so the question that you come up is, a lot of solar panels are leased, right? So what we've done to address this for you as agents is if in the MLS, there should be a section entitled solar panels, yes, no. So you'll need to ask the question, because I have heard anecdotal stories of financing falling apart because of those leased solar panels, depending on who the purveyor of those are. So if I'm a seller's agent, I want to disclose it and I want to have that information. If I'm a buyer's agent, I want to ask. For the purposes of the contract of actually transferring those documents, if the solar panel company would probably have a separate agreement if they wanted to do it. The other way you can check and see is most often it'll be a recording on the title, because it'll be an encumbrance that runs with the land. Okay?
So this isn't telling the seller that they need to pay it off?
No. It's saying that if you're going to transfer it, it either needs to be free of liens or they need to come up with an agreement. The problem becomes is sometimes those solar panel agreements, which are separate, not necessarily controlling on the buyer, require the seller to do certain things to transfer it. For example, if the seller, the new buyer, doesn't qualify for their lien, for their lease option, they're sometimes requiring the buyer or the seller to buy those out. That's really outside the scope of the RPA. It's really going to depend on not to give you the lawyer answer of it depends, but it depends on the agreement with whatever solar power provider they have. Okay?
Then it should be included subject to the lease transferring to the new buyer.
So the question is, it should be subject to that. So what I would tell you to do is that's why it's in the MLS, to give you the heads up that you need to ask those questions and find that out depending on the purveyor. Since we're talking about solar panels, we might as well talk about smart water liens as well. This is really not to do with the RPA, but it's an issue that comes up with solar power. So the water district offers that rebate to take out, they call it smart landscaping, take out water conscious landscaping and replace it with desert, but it actually creates a lien on the property that precludes you from putting water use back in. So if you have a client who wants to buy a pool, wants to build a house, get a house and put a pool in, if that lien is in the backyard, they're going to get a very disgruntled letter from the water district and a lot of fines. So that's also in the MLS for you to be aware of that. And the thing is that it's recorded on the title, but typically, I don't know, typically most listing agents are not reviewing title encumbrances to figure out what properties they're going to show to their clients in the MLS. So you'll need to be aware of that as well. Okay?
To the paragraph 1A.
1A? Okay.
Yes. It says over here that EMD box 1 is presented with the offer or box, and then you have two empty lines. What do you put in there?
Okay.
Doesn't make sense to have
Okay, so let me make sure I understand your question.
like over here, you see, you mark
Okay.
this paragraph, then you have to type in something.
Yes.
Or you
Or.
just omit that and you just follow to this one and you have or.
Well, the or that you're referencing is, so let's make sure this is clear. So we're looking at 1A, earnest money deposit is checkbox, presented with this offer or blank, period. You write it, okay? So if it is, to be submitted within 2 days by by the check or whatever, or we have specific language about wire transfer. So the first one is it's presented with the offer, 2 is your or your third is it's going to be wired, and then you're going to tell them how it's going to be wired in. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Let's now move on to page 3 again. Due diligence. Again, this is probably the biggest change to the document, section 7. Due diligence. It's been bumped up. The inspections provision has been incorporated inside the due diligence section because your inspections are conducted pursuant to your due diligence. So let me tell you what's gone and why. So the first thing you'll notice, the language that says that the buyer submits repair requests to the seller and the due diligence provision is extended until the seller responds. That's gone. You have a hard due diligence due date, okay? Whatever number you put in there, that's it. Now let me tell you why. Contracts have to start and contracts have to end. Currently there's litigation in Nye County over vacant land where the seller is arguing that the 16-month delay in responding to the buyer's request for repairs was reasonable.
Wow.
So the concern with that is if you have a judge who says, yep, that's void. So contracts have to start and contracts have to end. So now you have a hard due date. So, and this is quite common in most states. For example, California, if anybody practices in California, they have like 7 due dates within their due diligence period, and they walk you through it, and it's defaulted to about 21 days. We're going to give you a blank. You'll need to figure out whatever is that issue there and figure that out. So the idea was the contracts have to start and end. So it can't just be this open time period. The other thing that you'll notice is missing is the repair amount that the seller agrees they'll do blank amount of repairs. That's gone too. The reason why that was done is I think it created a false opinion of the seller that this is the amount of money I have to repair. But then the next provision of the contract says, hey, if these inspections come back and the lender requires us to do repairs, the parties reserve the right to negotiate that. So we took that out because the reality is you know, if I have an FHA loan and the FHA says you got to fix these 5 things, somebody's got to fix them or I'm not buying the house. So that was removed. So due diligence. So if I'm going back to my office and I'm talking to my agents about this, I'm saying you need to make sure you pick a realistic date, okay? I don't know what that is. Everybody asks me, and I don't mean to be sarcastic, but that's what real estate professionals tell lawyers. I don't know. That's why I hired a realtor when I bought my house earlier this year. I had no idea how long the due diligence period was supposed to take. You tell me. So you'll need to figure out that number. What I would tell you is silence is an answer. If I'm your client and our due diligence period ends tomorrow and you have not gotten a response from the seller, that's your answer. There's a misconception that a seller is required to respond to the buyer's repair requests. If I'm the seller and I don't want to, Dale's my agent. What's your name? Scott. And Scott's the buyer's agent. So Scott's conveyed his client's request for repairs to Dale. Dale's conveyed it to me as the seller. You cannot force me to respond. Period. I don't have to. Now, Dale, as a licensee under NRS 645, does have an obligation to go to Scott and say, I'm sorry, that Sanders guy's kind of being a jerk. He's not answering. What do you want to do? Okay? Then the buyer would need to make the decision. Is this the dream house that I want to move forward with and accept the property as is, as identified in 7C? Or do I want to get my earnest money back and go find a different house with a seller who will actually respond? Okay? The irony is you're doing that right now as it is. At some point. You know, if it's 60 days, 90 days, 7 months, and the seller hasn't responded, you're eventually going to sit down with your client and say, what do you want to do? They may not respond, so our options are move forward, waive the contingency, accept the property as is, or get your earnest money back and let's go find you a house you want to buy. So all this is doing is making you come to that decision in a quicker pace. All designed with the idea that the purchase agreement is supposed to either get you to a successful real estate transaction or get you out of this unsuccessful real estate transaction and into a successful transaction. Okay? So again, this is why we start talking about the acceptance dates from the very beginning, because the acceptance date is the date that you calculate all these other due dates from. And if you mess this up, you might as well just call your E&O insurance. If you put 6 hours in the due diligence provision, that's all on you. Yes, ma'am.
Is the acceptance date day one or is the next day day one?
That's a good question. Is acceptance date day one or next day? The way it's defined in your agreement, it is the date that both parties get executed contracts and they're delivered. So that could be, if it's today at 3 o'clock, it's today. If it's 11:59 tonight, today's the day. If it's 12:01, it's tomorrow.
Day one.
So today's day one. So you start if you put 21 days, you calculate your 21 days from today.
Once both parties have copies.
Once both parties have copies, okay? So how I would do that, if I'm the party who's sending the last copy back and I'm doing it by email, I'm making sure that I have delivery receipt, I'm making sure that I have read receipt, that I've got proof of when that date's going to calculate from. Now, that being said, if you're worried, or you know that, gosh, it's coming up on a weekend, are we going to be able to do that? And you're worried about making sure that you have that. If you want 21 days counted from the next day after, maybe go up to 22. You know, there was 16 instead of 14. Maybe build in a little bit of cushion when you do that. Yes, sir.
So what if you have a document that was e-signed by one of the parties on the 10th,
Okay.
but the agency or the agent didn't send it to you until 2 or 3 days later or a day later?
Well, then the date of delivery is when all the due dates start. You know, this is a legitimate question. What if an agent thinks they're being sneaky and I'm going to sit on it for 5 days to give my client a little extra time? Maybe, but I'm sure our good friends at the real estate division would absolutely love the fact that you're putting in writing that you're intentionally violating your statutory obligations. I can tell you your good friends down in Professional Standards would love the fact that you put in writing that you violated Article 9 of the Code of Ethics.
Yep, that having been said, a lot of people operate outside of that anyway.
Hey, as I go to every single one of the professional standards cases in Southern Nevada, and as an attorney, I would just say thank you for proving my case that you violated it. One of the things that I can't fix in the purchase agreement is agents who don't want to act professionally, agents who don't want to live up to their obligations under statute. That would be, you know, the real estate division. But you're right, that's a potential scenario.
So delivery to the agent is considered delivery
Yes.
to the party?
Yes. Yes. Hold on. Let me answer her question. Delivery to the agent is delivered. So let's go to section 24 of your contract. Or excuse me, section 23, which is your definition. So we're looking at page 8. We're looking at number 11. Line 11. Delivered. Delivered means personally delivered to parties or respective agents, transmitted by facsimile, electronics, overnight delivery, blah, 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 blah. That language is in your current RPA today. Let's go down to line 21, to receipt. Receipt means delivered to the party or the party's agent. So yes, when we get to the CIC section, section 10, if the CIC resale package is delivered to your office and you sit on it for 4 days, guess what? Your client has 1 day or you're going to get sued, one or the other. So we'll talk about that. But yeah, your definition is when you get it. Yes, sir.
So on that particular note, if there is a delay due to a holiday weekend, whatever the case may be, or I'm sorry, but my seller is I can't locate because they're on a cruise ship, but by the next business day they'll be able to sign, which means you lost a couple of days.
Well, if the parties haven't, if you don't have final signature, you haven't technically accepted the document pursuant to the definition. So, okay.
Final signature of the seller.
When both parties get the fully executed document and when that's delivered.
Okay.
Over to you.
Then on another note,
Okay.
as far as the due diligence period,
Yes.
obviously, you know, one could ask for an extra time if necessary, but one has to also distinguish between the due diligence period for the inspections and also the loan, obviously.
Yeah.
Each one merits its own little time, but that has to be communicated, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so let's talk about really quick about that due diligence, and then I'll get the rest of the questions. So the due diligence, what you have to resolve within that time period, the repairs don't have to be done. The parties just have to agree in writing, okay? Or you ask for more time, or you waive it, okay? Or you cancel the deal. So you don't have to have all the roof repairs done by day 21. You just have to agree to it in writing. Norma Jean.
With regards to someone holding off and not sending you the offer, the only thing that you can really do is do a counteroffer immediately and extend all your dates and get that signed. And that would then start time again because you sent in an hour counter.
There's a confusion there, in my opinion, because...
Hold on, sir. Let's. This guy's been waiting back here, so I'm going to get his question. I'll come back to you. Yes, sir.
Say I deliver something.
Okay.
By email.
Okay.
However, the other party says, well, I never received it.
Okay.
If I verify I did deliver it, what's your look?
So this is why I hate email. And this is why I hate text messages even more. I don't want to sound like a crotchety old man, but I really miss the days of U.S. mail because it was so easy to prove that you got it. So in delivery, particularly when we get to the CIC section, we're talking about delivering. If you're going to cancel within that 5-day window after you've received the HOA packet, you've got to be mindful of this. So U.S. mail would be better because the courts will approve your photocopy. Certified mail is even greater because you get that lovely green postcard that keeps me warm at night knowing that you got my letter. Email is good, but I would make sure you have return receipt with dates and like a description of, because then at least if it's an issue before a courtroom, I could go in and say, is this your email address, yes or no, and do that kind of thing. The problem I have with text messages is there is no way to prove when that was sent, whose phone number that is. If you're like me, you've got your buddy's nicknames in your phone and who the heck is T-Dog or whoever that person is, that's difficult to prove. So if you're gonna, and the problem is most of your clients love to communicate via text, right? So what I would tell you to do with text messages, and then I'll get to your question, is there's software that will convert your texts into emails. And I would highly recommend that you do something like that so you at least have some documentation. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it just seems like between agent to agent, everybody's scanning, back and forth, time, it's not once in a while, he said, well, I never received it. Although I have verification I delivered it.
Yeah. So what I would do is I would almost always use read receipt and delivery receipt. And here's the other reason why. So not only do you have that, but then if they say, I don't do it, I can get up as your attorney in a courtroom and ask you, isn't it in fact your pattern and practice on every real estate email that you send that you get a delivery receipt? Yes. Isn't it in fact your practice and pattern as a professional real estate agent that you get a read receipt? Yes. So then I can go to the jury and say, who are you going to believe? The guy who claims that he never got it, or my client, who we've clearly come in and established, does this every single time. Okay? All right. You had a question.
Earlier, basically, it was just for you to
Sure.
clarify, as long as the seller acknowledges, then that's the contract already. One party signs and then the other. That's when the effective date and moment begins.
Well, and it's when it's so the definition is when that's delivered. So it's not just date signed, and then it's when it's disseminated to the parties. So if I'm the last person who, if there's been a counteroffer over, and my client's the last person to sign that thing's a hot potato. I want it out of my hands as quickly as possible and start moving. Okay? All right. Any other questions about due diligence? So one other thing I wanted to tell you. Let's go to line 7, or section 7, page 3, line 24 and 25. There's the question about what do we do? We require the seller to keep the utilities and the pilot lights on so they can conduct the inspections. There's a lot of issue, but Dave, what do we do? Can we ask them to extend the due diligence period if they turn it on? Again, we're right back to the same problem that contracts have to start and contracts have to end. So the reality is, if they're not turning the utilities on for you to conduct your inspections, you're turning to your client saying, what do you want to do? Do you want to ask for an extension to see if they'll turn the utilities on? Do you want to waive these conditions? And if you'll notice 7C, the bottom of the page, requires the buyer to acknowledge that, hey, if my due diligence is today, closing on September 2nd, and I don't do anything, I don't either cancel the agreement, get an agreement in writing between the parties as how we're going to address these issues, I have waived my due diligence condition, okay? This is standard language in most contracts in the Western United States. We got this from, again, California is phenomenal with their forms. If you've ever been or gone over to look your practice in California or you've seen their documents, it's an amazing system they've got over there. Utah was also a place we took some of this language. The reason why I like Utah is pursuant to state law, the real estate division in the state of Utah issues all forms for residential real estate transactions. And by law, you must use, I think there's 15 forms. So, sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Client, you want to change this, but state law requires us to do it. So we looked there as well. So this language is pretty common. We kept the existing language in 7B about, if you're going to ask for repairs, give us the information. So that's your 7A, the property inspection condition. That's basically your same language. So let's now turn to page 4, inspections. So this is something that I'm really excited about, and it just shows you how nerdy I am. So instead of, when I bought my house, I executed my contract like everybody else did on my iPhone, right? And I remember scrolling through like what seemed to be like 5,000 pages of boxes with an X in it. So those pages of boxes are gone. You now have a table. Our forms provider Instinet has married drop-down menus under the section that says paid by. So every time your agents click on paid by, they're going to get a drop-down menu selection of seller, buyer, 50/50, waived, or NA. And they're not allowed to move on until they make a selection. So there will be no blanks for you to worry about, okay? Now, if you've got the folks who are old school and want to print it out, that's fine. They'll just need to write it in. But if they use Transaction Desk, it's drop down for 7D, 8A, and Section 10 when we talk about the CIC section. And I remember I was so excited when we went to the vendor and I said, hey, can you do this? And I remember thinking that I'd had this like great eureka moment and like they were going to sing my praises from the mountaintops and I was going to change real estate. And they just looked at me like I was stupid and said, yeah, we can totally do that. So a little bit of down on me, but exciting for everybody else. So let's now turn to Section 8B, prorations. This has been changed. There are no more boxes here. 8B now says, this is the stuff we prorate. So basically, the things that are normally prorated are going to be prorated. If you don't like it, you'll need to counter it and address it in an addendum, okay? So the normal stuff that's prorated is just prorated. If you want to fight over it, do it in a separate document, okay? Any other questions about 7D or Section 8 before we move on? Yes, ma'am.
So the title policy and the lender's policy, we're not violating CFPB and say...
Sorry, I can't hear you. Can you hold on 1 second?
For the lender's title policy, owner's title policy, we're not violating CFPB if we say the buyer's paying for it all or the seller's paying for it all.
That's a good question. So the question is, are we violating RESPA, is I believe the question you're asking for, the Real Estate Service Providers Act. The answer is, typically it's the buyer's choice of those providers, but there's a big caveat, is often if the seller wants to pay for it. So because it's potentially something that could be negotiated and the parties could agree to it, if the seller feels that strongly that they've got to use Dave's title, then arguably they could do that. So we left the option. What I would also tell you about RESPA, without going off into like a 6-hour RESPA discussion, which I would totally love to do, so let's do that, is that the buyer doesn't have to choose between their legal rights to pick their real estate service providers, closing providers, and their dream house. If the buyer really feels that, gosh, if we don't agree, the seller counters back and says you must use Jim Bob's title or whatever, the buyer can proceed with the transaction, and under statute they have a year after close of escrow to bring an individual lawsuit. They have 3 years, the CFPB has 3 years to bring a civil action, and if Director Corduroy has his way, they can go after you administratively from 2 years from the date the CFP was born. And no, I'm not kidding. That is a separate lawsuit before the District Court of Appeal, or the District of Columbia Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. So the answer is, we kept it because it's possible for there's some negotiation, but if you want to talk about RESPA afterwards, I'd be more than happy to, okay? All right. Any other questions about this section before we move on? All right, let's talk about section 10, common interest communities, and what I like to call the monthly phone calls I get from real estate agents who are about to get sued. Okay, CIC. Regular basis, I get people asking me, Dave, we don't like the fact that the 5-day notice, the 5-day cancellation has specific language. So let me walk you through the changes we did, and then we'll spend some few minutes talking about it. The first thing we did is we actually marked out in the contract that the seller has to pay for the resale package. Before, it was one of those 50-50 seller-buyer, and there were some parties attempting to negotiate that. Statute says the seller must pay for it. Now, I always get the crafty realtors who ask me, but Dave, can't the parties agree that the buyer will pay for this? And I like to be a little sarcastic, so forgive me. And I say, that's a great idea. Why don't you come down with me to the U.S. Attorney's office on Las Vegas Boulevard. We'll sit in his office. You'll tell him that you contractually agreed that heroin is legal and shoot up in front of him and see what happens. The reality is you cannot contractually waive statutory obligations, period. So the seller must pay for this, okay? So that's the first thing that's bold at the beginning of section 10. The bullet points are your options of what to do if you want to cancel the agreement. Your existing agreement has 2 ways of cancellation. The first is upon acceptance, you have 5 days from the day after acceptance to review the HOA documents, the CIC resale package, and if you want to cancel it, by statute, you have to send it U.S. mail or hand delivery by midnight on the 5th day. I get about a phone call a month from an agent or a broker who says, so I emailed the cancellation because my client didn't like the CIC packet, and then I say, you really should call your broker, you really should contact your E&O insurance, and here's the state bar's attorney referral phone number because you're going to need one of these too. The statute, NRS 116, says if you want to cancel the purchase agreement because you don't like the HOA docs, that 5-day window, the statute requires delivery by U.S. mail or hand delivery, period. Now, that may change, but that would change in October of 2017 if it changes. There's discussions about doing it, but until they actually move, I know it's hard to believe that our good friends in Carson City may or may not act, but you would need to make sure that actually happens. If that happens, we'll change the section. But as of right now, those are the only 2 ways to do that service. So if you send it by email, you're going to get sued. If you fax it, you got problems. So let's talk about what you would do in the scenarios you got. So U.S. mail, simple. Phone call about 2 months ago. But Dave, what do I do? My client called me at 6 o'clock at night on the 5th day and said, what do I do? Wanted to cancel. What I would do is I would get in my car and I would drive down to the U.S. Post Office by the airport that is open 24 hours a day.
Till 9 p.m.
Okay, till 9. Okay, till 9 p.m. The other thing I would be doing is I wouldn't be having this conversation on the 5th day. Okay? So let's talk about the hand delivery. How do you prove hand delivery? Very simple thing. It's called receipt of copy. It's nothing fancy. It's a document that lawyers use all the time. So all it is you get in Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever you use, and you type receipt of copy on, insert date. I received the following, insert the title of the document, and then I would put the information of where you're delivering it to, so whatever the real estate company is. And then have a blank for signature and then a date. And then I make 2 copies of that. And I send it with my runner, I go over, deliver it myself, and I walk into the receptionist of, since your shirt says Realty One Group, and I say, hey, I've got a receipt of copy. The receptionist signs both pieces of paper. I give them one along with the cancellation. I take the other original back with me and now have proof that we canceled the contract pursuant to NRS 116. Okay? Any questions on that? Yes, ma'am.
I'm old school and I deliver all CIC packages by hand to the real estate office just because I don't trust the old stuff. So anyway, I went over to a unnamed brokerage on Friday afternoon at 5:01 when they were closed.
Yep.
So So if, in your scenario, a person called at 6 p.m., mail would be the only
Mail would be
option.
the only option. So what I would tell you is I hate reacting on the last day because all you're doing is walking into problems. You really need to be having this conversation with your client on day 3, which gets back, and I'll get you in just one second. So, which gets me back to the delivery of the CIC package. We've already talked about the delivery or receipt pursuant to our contract is when it's delivered upon the agent. So if I am the buyer's agent and I get a CIC package and I'm going to Maui, it's delivered today, but I'm on the plane to Maui and I don't get back till Tuesday. The fact that I haven't delivered it to my client is all on me. The due date, that 5-day calculation doesn't happen when the buyer's agent gives it to the buyer. It's when the buyer's agent gets it. When it's dropped off at your office, when you get it in the, you know, when it's, that's the day that it starts to calculate. So if I am a broker, I would have an office policy that we get rid of those things. Anytime a CIC package comes in, agent is missing, you go, the team is all out, you go find the broker and you get that out there. You can email them to the client. You can email that packet to the buyer once you get it. But I would not want it sitting, even for a day, because as the attorney who's suing you, because the buyer loses their earnest money, I would say, it's not because my client couldn't make a decision in 4 days. It's because the slothful, inattentive real estate professional violated their fiduciary duties and their statutory obligations and thereby damaged my client to the tune of $1.5 million in compensatory damages with $8 million in attorney's fees. Okay? So, don't leave them in your office. The other great thing about it, if you do that and they try to sue you, then I get to say stuff like, well, isn't it your pattern and practice at Super Awesome Realty to never let these sit in your office? Yep, we have an office policy that we turn them back out to the client the same day we receive them. So because the 5 days starts counting the next day. So you get it, you give it to them, they have their whole time period. That's our pattern and practice. Here's our office policy that says this, we do it. This is the log that I make the receptionist mark and they hate me for it. And this is why they're not entitled to $1.8 million in compensatory damage because we complied with the statute. This gentleman was next and then I'll get you.
Phrase troubles me a little bit. Maybe you could give me some clarification as far as the seller ordering the resale package within 2 business days.
Yes.
Most sellers are reluctant until such time when the due diligence period is already after. They feel like they shouldn't pay for anything, something that's not going to go through or may not go through. So any pointers on that, so we can at least.
What I would tell you is, so did everybody hear his question? Sellers don't want to order this. Well, I almost feel like I'm talking to my 13-year-old. There are lots of things in life we don't want to do. I don't mean to be snarky, but the answer, again, one of the upsides and downsides of both of our professions is we don't get to make decisions. We just get to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. If I'm the seller's agent, I'm saying, look, the contract says you need to order it within 2 days. I highly advise you do it. I get that you're worried about all these other issues, but you agreed to this, and I do it. And I would put that in writing. Now, whether or not they do that, that's a different issue. Now, there's also, you know, the seller's agent could potentially go out and pay it if you wanted to do that. For antitrust purposes, I will not advise you on whether or not that's a good idea business-wise or not. But the reality is the seller has the obligation to do it. It's set forth in statute. Just because they don't want to doesn't mean anything. We had this issue come up this morning where they said, can they reuse the package? And you know, they ordered it 6 weeks ago. They were told by somebody that it's updated. I wouldn't go down that road either, because if I'm the buyer, my 5-day window doesn't technically start until you actually have delivered me the full resale package as established by the statute. So I wouldn't do that either. So, you know, at the end of the day, if the seller, you know, just like a request for request, if they don't act, as long as you're doing your job to protect yourself, that's what I would tell you is the best thing to do. You were next, yes ma'am.
What is reasonable in terms of being able to respond to like a 10 o'clock email where you receive document? Am I supposed to like turn this over to the client at 10:05? What do you think?
Turn what over? Are you talking the CIC package?
Not necessarily the CIC, just whatever.
Well, reasonable is reasonable. Do I think that you have to be up in the middle of the night and respond to your clients, I don't know if that's reasonable. There are certain things that I would tell you we probably want to move faster on. Receipt of fully executed contracts, the dates start moving, resale packages, inspections, those kinds of things. Unfortunately, what is reasonable if you're going to the end audience with a court is going to be something that is going to be nuanced. It's not going to be, it's going to be a question of fact. It's going to be something that's going to depend on all of the factors. So I would tell you, that respond as quickly as possible, but I don't think you have to stay up in the middle of the night checking your iPhone.
Your due diligence period, or in the statutes it says you're to present earnest money within, is it 24 hours or?
One business day, or is it the parties agreed?
Right, yeah, right. So you base it on that. I mean, none of us stay up 24/7. So it's just judgment. I mean, if the house is burning down and you get the phone call, then you make the phone call and say, I got bad news for you.
I think your question is, what do we do if the HOA takes forever? Right. Okay. So under your first, so let me kind of walk through the rest of the cancellation options, because I think it's going to answer your question. So 5-day cancellation is by statute. We've talked about it. You have to do the notice in the 2 ways. We've talked about it. In your existing contract right now, you have another cancellation ability where the seller doesn't provide the CIC package to the buyer within 15 days after acceptance. That is contractual. It's not based in statute. Okay? Your current contract, though, however, requires you to cancel the contract using the same service requirements, notice requirements, so U.S. mail and hand delivery. So when we were creating this new form, and I asked the practitioners, is there a particular reason you want to deliver this the most difficult way possible? Or would you like to maybe adopt 1980s technology and allow the use of a facsimile machine? So we spun that off second. That's the second bullet point under Section 10. That 15-day notice, you can notice it. You can serve that by email and facsimile. Okay, so you don't have to do that. So, so to answer your question about so for the 5-day notice, it's as soon as the buyer gets it. If it's the 15-day notice, that right to cancel arguably starts on day 16. And arguably isn't extinguished if you get the CIC package on day 22. But your 5-day statutory right would trigger. Does that make sense? So you have the right to cancel if they don't get it there quickly. We'll talk a little bit about HOA litigation in just a second. I want to get her question, and then I'm going to take you on a slight tangent. Yes, ma'am.
What would you recommend for your, and I've only seen this with investors,
Mm-hmm.
really would like to get an answer, when they submit offers and they do not comply with the 24-hour earnest deposit, and their agents don't enforce it either.
Well,
how would you? What's the best practice?
Well, the statute requires it. State law requires it. I don't know if the best thing, the statute requires it. There's certain statutory sanctions. I'm hesitant to give you specifics, always do this, because I can't really give you legal advice. That would be a scenario not to give you the standard lawyer answer, but there's a lot of factors there, and I don't want to say, particularly because we're recording it, this is the answer, this is the gospel truth, because here's a little sneak peek about lawyers. We give you our best guess until a judge tells us we totally got it wrong. Okay, so
and what she's mentioning, would that be considered a breach of contract?
Yes, if the contract says you have to have the funds at that delivered within 1 point, it breached a contract. So you could end the agreement if you really wanted to.
But sir, what they do, let me clarify, is they submit the offer, it's accepted, they utilize the whole due diligence period to do their inspection, and then come back and say, we decided based on the repairs that we don't want the property, but no earnest deposit was why we're saying.
Well,
that's my concern.
Well then, if there's no earnest money and the contract requires them, they are arguably in material breach of the contract, and then you need to figure out what you wanted to do. I do want to take you on a side tangent really quickly under CIC packages really quickly. Recently, I've been getting reports of some HOAs, when you ask them their favorite question, is there any litigation involving your HOA? And they'll just say yes. There's a recent case out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals about 2 or 3 weeks ago involving HOA foreclosures. You might have heard about it in the newspaper. So what happened is the HOA statute has what they call an opt-in notice provision, which requires the lender to affirmatively reach out to the HOA and say, hey, if the borrower doesn't pay their HOA dues, you need to tell us before you foreclose. Okay? So a lot of those cases a lot of those properties went through. The banks were never notified of the foreclosure of the process. So Wells Fargo brought a lawsuit against one of the parties who bought one of these houses. In federal court, went up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals says, yeah, there's this thing called the U.S. Constitution and the 14th Amendment of said U.S. Constitution that requires due process. So you can't take the bank's interest in the property without telling them, and voided the sale. Now, what I don't know is how many of those HOA sales proceeded with the opt-in notice requirement. But arguably, all of those are void in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is basically the Western United States. So there's a potential for a large number of HOAs being involved in litigation. As a side note, if you represented anybody involved in one of these transactions, you need to go see an attorney, okay? I don't want to take time today explaining it, but you do need to go see an attorney. Yes?
I just have a question, comment. Regarding the CIC resale package, the practical side of that law is that oftentimes the sale does not go through 2 or 3 times, and the seller is required 2 or 3 times to pay for that. So what, just a commissioner thing, I would like to just ask that somebody come forward at a commission hearing, bring that issue up. The LCB will be available after December this year, but we could do something about that if we had the issue brought up at a commission hearing. Yes, just bring it up during public comment that you'd like to see something done like that. We make a list for the next LCB, and you already got it. I'll do it for you.
Okay. Okay, let's jump back into CIC. We've walked through the changes to the CIC packet. We've walked through the section changes. There's one other Supreme Court case I do want to mention really quickly, since we're talking about how much the courts have been busy. This is a Nevada Supreme Court decision. I wrote an article about it in this month's September's S&R. It's about non-compete clauses in contracts. If you are brokers and you have non-compete clauses in your independent contractor agreements, you need to have them reviewed. There was a case out of Reno involving a casino host working for the Atlantis Casino. The employment agreement they had a non-compete clause that stated that the employee couldn't take another casino gaming job within 150 miles of the Atlantis for a calendar year. This casino host over time grew disgruntled, unhappy with the Atlantis, and went to go work for the Grand Sierra without waiting out the non-compete. So of course they sued. The Nevada Supreme Court, in a very interesting ruling, came down and said the non-compete provision I just described was too onerous and therefore said it's unenforceable. Making that decision even more interesting, typically the courts do what they call blue pencil. They'll go through and fix your contract for you. We'll take this out, but we'll fix it and make the underlying agreement still enforceable. The court said in this case, this is so egregious, so unenforceable, and so onerous upon this casino host that we're voiding the entire agreement. Voiding it. It never existed. So if you have independent contractor agreements with your agents, and you should, if you have non-compete provisions in there, you really need to have an attorney look at them because of this decision, okay? The S&R this month, September, I wrote an article about it if you want the actual case links and things like that. Okay, any more questions about CIC packets? Okay, let's move on to section 11, disclosures. A couple of minor changes here. If you'll notice, the identified disclosures are just those that are required by statute. If you want to use any of the optional GLVR ones, that's what others for. The other thing you'll notice is there's a sentence that's been removed. Your existing RPA has language in it that says that all of these disclosures are incorporated into the agreement. And we've been getting feedback that certain lenders were demanding to see those, the SRPD. I'm sure they always want to look at the open range disclosure. I mean, who doesn't want to read that? They were requiring them as a part of the lending process because they're claiming, well, they're incorporated in the contract. So we first thought about removing this section entirely, but then we thought maybe you brokers really wouldn't like that because this is more of a check thing to make sure all those forms are there. So we removed the sentence that says they're incorporated. So this is really just a resuscitation of statutory state and federal required documents that go along with the purchase agreement. They're not technically incorporated herein. Okay? Any questions on that? All right. Let's talk about section 18, page 6, our default provision, and our other Nevada Supreme Court case that we need to talk about today. Okay? Let's talk about the mediation provision. The mediation provision in the RPA did not change. The legal landscape behind it did. In February, the Nevada Supreme Court made a ruling about mediation provisions in contracts. It involved a Reno company and an Alaska company. Reno company was a company that made heavy machinery. They entered into a franchise agreement with a company out of Alaska to sell the heavy equipment. As things happened, the deal fell apart. The contract fell apart, and there was a question of about $100,000 worth of heavy machinery outstanding. The Reno company, their contract had a mediation provision very similar to yours in the RPA. And so the Reno company started reaching out to the Alaska group and said, we really need to mediate. We really need to mediate. Gosh, it would be great if we mediated. But never formally said, in accordance with your RPA, pursuant to section 18A, we invoke our right to mediate. What they did do is they filed a lawsuit in Washoe County. A cause of action called declaratory relief, which is a means by which that you ask a court to declare, in this case, that their contract was valid and order them to go to mediation. The Alaska company rolled in and said, what are we doing here? We've got this mediation provision. We're supposed to mediate before we go to the courthouse. You never formally invoked it. You talked about it, you danced around it, but you never actually formally did it. Went all the way up to the Nevada Supreme Court, and earlier this year, the Nevada Supreme Court determined that the mediation provisions in contract are a, quote, condition precedent to litigation. And since lawyers are paid by the syllable, that's like $5 grand right there, okay? So what that means is, and then the Supreme Court went ahead and said, so Reno, folks, you shouldn't have brought the lawsuit. And we're awarding an award of about 70 to 80 grand in attorney's fees that Alaska racked up on this, and we're ordering you to pay it, and then we're ordering you to go to mediation where you should have been to start the process off, okay? So, if you have any mediation provision in any contract in any of your business or in real estate, it is now a condition precedent. So what does that mean for the purposes of the RPA? It means that when you get the mediation provision, when you get your counteroffer back, and if sometimes they sign it, sometimes they don't, you really need to clarify. Is this an error where they just didn't initial it and they need to go back and do that? Or was this an intentional act that they don't want to mediate? So you'll need to clarify that, okay? Now, for boots on the ground perspective, most of our earnest money disputes are less than $15,000. The small claims court in Clark County has now increased their jurisdiction. They handle everything 15 grand or less, okay? So if your earnest money dispute's less than that, you're going to small claims court. If it's more than that, you're getting your big boy pants on and you're going down to the big boy courthouse and got lots and lots of lawyers, and that'll be fun for everybody. Small claims, though, their first step, and for those of you who have had the opportunity of participating in our small claims court process, what is the first thing they ask you? Have you mediated? And if you say no, they send you to the small claims mediation. So, for reality's sake, if there's not a mediation, if the parties refuse to agree to the mediation provision in the RPA, all they're really giving up is the ability to mediate at GLVAR. Now, why does that matter to you? If you, as the realtor, roll in with your clients down to small claims court, the first thing the judge is going to say is, who are you and what are you doing here? And then ask you to leave. If you mediate at GLVAR, we have what we call invited guests. Now, let me make this very clear. You are not an attorney. Mediation of an earnest money dispute is a breach of contract lawsuit. It is way outside the scope of NRS 645. All right? But we do allow you to come. So you're not going to advocate, you're not going to argue, you're not going to tell the mediator why your client's entitled to the money, because that's what lawyers do. But you are able to come with them. You know, it's a scary thing to come down and mediate. Most of the people have never done that. You'll at least be there, right? What's your name? Sabrina. So what happens is I have my earnest money dispute. It's a mediation. I'm down here. I'm nervous. I've never done anything like this before. Sabrina comes with me. Now, she can't advocate for me, but she can sit with me. And let's be honest, I'm a train wreck, so she's holding my hand and keeping me together. And so what I do is I go home and I say, you know what? That realtor of mine, Sabrina, she's amazing. We got a house, the seller was kind of a jerk, we couldn't get it done, so they gave me, we had a dispute over our earnest money, and even though she didn't have to, she came with me. So I can't imagine why I would use any other realtor but Sabrina. And more importantly, I can't understand why people think realtors are worse than used car salesmen. They're just great people, right? So that's the benefit of doing it here. So practical tip today, again, the provision didn't change. It's exactly the same as it's been for a couple of years. But the law behind it has. Are there any questions on that?
So in the mediation section,
yes.
It says, notwithstanding the foregoing, in the event the buyer finds it necessary to file a claim for specific performance, this section shall not apply.
Yes.
So I've got clients that read that and they go, why should I bother with the mediation, the time, the expense, if it's not ever going to be a binding agreement? And in fact, if they do go to the mediation and they lose, it's created a condition precedent that could be a further burden against them when they go to court.
Okay.
And as you were mentioning earlier, the judge is the final audience. And so they look at any agreement and say, look, I don't care what it says here, if the association has a mediation agreement or not. I don't see any point in signing it or initialing it, because if I lose and I'm a very experienced buyer or seller or whatever, I know I'm going to end up in court. So why would I bother with an association-generated mediation?
That's a good question. So let's first talk about a couple of misconceptions that were there. Mediation, first of all, at GLVR and at the small claims court, is confidential. Settlement negotiations pursuant to statute are not admissible as evidence. So they're confidential. That's the first thing. Second of all, mediation is different from arbitration. Mediation is a third-party facilitator of dialogue. Okay? What that means is that the parties don't reach a mutual agreement, there is no resolution. They're free to go down to the courthouse. You know, your savvy buyers and sellers, if the number is less than 15 grand, small claims court requires them to do it by law. So you have to do it. So mediation, it's only if the buyer and the seller reach an agreement, then mediation is successful. If you go to mediation, even the required ones, and say, I don't want to settle, you satisfied your obligation under law, and then you're free to go down and litigate to your heart's content. So it's not like it's going to be used against them in the future. Judge probably won't even know which party decided not to mediate, and the lawyers can't say either because it's all confidential. So it's an opportunity to reach a resolution short of going down to small claims court. So again, and this is one of those ones that's interesting because, you know, whether or not a party should agree to mediation is, you know, again, kind of outside this. I would be hesitant saying, you know, when they ask you what you should do, should agree to this or not, I'd say, well, you know, that's that provision, it's a mediation provision, it's an alternative dispute resolution, but this is really a legal issue. If you've got questions on whether or not mediation is in your best interest, you may want to go talk to your attorney. So that's how I would handle it. Okay? Any other questions about the mediation provision before we get to liquidated damage? Oh, sorry, to address your second point. So the second point under, you brought up the buyer's right for specific performance. So specific performance is a very unique right. So it allows them to go outside of that just for specific performance. Does everybody understand what specific performance is? Are we all clear on that? Specific performance is where the buyer is going down to the courtroom and saying, Judge, order the seller to sell me the property. Okay, that's all it is. It's not damages. It is, I am ready, willing, and able to buy the property, and the seller is intentionally sabotaging it. Now, that being said, I'm not sure, and I can't give you legal advice, and so if your clients want to go down the road of specific performance, I'm not exactly sure that if someone who is getting a loan meets the qualifications to specifically perform. So, if they really want to go down the road of specific performance, I would tell them to find an attorney. I can also tell you that specific performance lawsuits are not done on a contingency. So the attorney who's going to do it is going to need a lot of money up front. Yes, sir.
So if the party does not initial that section and the contract goes through,
yep,
at some point they're just simply stating
they don't want to mediate a GOVR. Yeah, that's it.
And if any party comes forward and says we want you to sign that, or at least acknowledge that you're not, my concern would be that if they say something, or if there was another section added to it that says parties decide not to participate in mediation, that it could display potentially some bad faith?
Not necessarily. I mean, you have a right to litigate. If you don't want to mediate, you don't have to. There are tactical reasons as an attorney that I can tick off, and a variety of reasons why mediation would not be in your best interest. But those are not necessarily related to the RPA. So what the tip for you guys would be to make sure that if they're rejecting that, they're doing it intentionally and moving on. And then that's really it. Because if they're, most of the time the folks who are going to reject the mediation provision are either savvy business people who don't like mediation, they had a bad experience and they want to litigate, or lawyers, right? So that's what I would tell you on that section.
Okay, and just one last thing.
Okay.
We had a contract with our party, did not initial it, and the lender came back with a condition saying that they had to initial it. And so I came back to them with a response saying that they were not a party to the contract and that it was an option for the parties to sign that. It was not a mandated signature spot. And they said, oh, okay, just send us an addendum saying that. And that was
what I would do in light of the Nevada Supreme Court's decision, I would be reaching out to the other side and saying, hey, you didn't initial the mediation provision. Was this intentional? Yes. And then I'd be going back to my client and saying, hey, they don't want to mediate. Do you want to continue on with the transaction? If they say no, then that's fine. If they say yes, then I would definitely put into an addendum, particularly in light of the Nevada Supreme Court's decision, that the parties agree to waive 18A. Okay? Let's talk liquidated damages, 18C, which is the seller's liquidated damages. Okay? So your previous RPA had actual damages for the seller and liquidated damages for the seller, and had the buyer picking which one of those they would be controlling. And I'll be honest with you, I always struggled with this because I understand the concept within real estate that, well, this is the buyer's offer. But remedies is a specific part of law, and it is usually the aggrieved party that gets to pick the remedies, not the bad actor. So we switched, so that was taken out. And then there was discussion about the purpose of a liquidated damages provision in its entirety. A purpose of a liquidated damages provision is to say, we can't figure out what the damages are, so we're going to cap them at whatever the number. In this case, it's the earnest money. They're a common provision in contracts in and outside of real estate. They typically are just that provision. So rather than having a choice where you had before where you could either choose actual damages or liquidated damages, we took that out. And the reason was because the last thing you want to do as a real estate professional is answer questions on whether or not they should be worried about a liquidated damages provision. I'm an attorney and I don't really like to do that on a regular basis. I explain the pros and cons and let the client make the decision. So we left the section just as the seller agrees that if they have damages, it's going to be limited to the buyer's EMD. Now, in reality, what does that mean? Well, it means that folks like the gentleman in the back who's got savvy clients who are used to this stuff, they're going to say, we won't agree to 17C. And lawyers like me are going to say, we won't agree to 17C. They'll tell you to counter it out. And then the other side will have to decide whether or not they want to proceed with a contract that is actual damages versus liquidated damages. Okay? Any questions about that?
So I think it's
Sure.
fair to add it under additional terms.
Well, you know, I would be, you know, if they don't want to agree to it, then you would counter back saying, you know, the seller refuses to agree to 17C. And then if they agree to it, then that's fine. Okay? Any questions about that before we move on? All right. Well, we're nearly finished. So let's go to page 9. Biggest change on page 9 is the confirmation of representation. We added a line for the broker's license number. Now, the reason why we did this is, again, our good friends at the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau require the lenders to get, the escrow to get the broker office license number. However, in the state of Nevada, we don't have broker office license number. So the CFPB has said, we want the broker's license. Now, please note, this is your license number issued by the real estate division. I had a very excited person tell me that they shared their business license number that the Secretary of State issues to them. This is also not your public ID. Again, license number from the real estate division here, okay? We put the agent's number in there as well. I can tell you one of the things we did as a part of this is this document was approved by the board of directors about 60 days ago. But after that, what we did is we got a small group of people together. We had them basically beta tested in Transaction Desk to make sure all the, you know, the fillable form sections actually work. And one of the things we were able to find was this was auto-populating with the public ID. So we had them stop that, okay? So the idea is when this form goes live on October 1st, it'll be ready for use. The next thing we did is lines 30 through 35 on page 9, the disclosure of interest. We were asked by the division to take a look at this, and so we did. Now, please note, we kind of did this inverted because, you know, oftentimes, you know, most of the time your agents are going through there and they're checking the first box. So the first box here is, I do not have an interest I need to disclose. The second box is, I do, okay? So the idea was, as your agents are moving through the thing, they're going to check the first box, so we might as well make the first box the standard answer, okay? Any questions on that? All right. Oh, yes, ma'am.
I have two. Sorry, so I sell a lot of properties that my husband is the principal of an LLC.
Yep.
So which, would I be a principal or would I be a family or friend relationship?
Well, that is a very good question. You're married, that's correct?
I am married.
Okay. Well, do you want the lawyer answer? Because we could, the answer is you could probably go with either one, because Nevada's a community property state, so technically everything your husband owns, you have a 50% interest in, but that seems probably too lawyerly. I would probably just mark family and say husband has interest in the LLC.
And then what is firm relationships? We have other investors that we work with.
Well, it's, again, it's a family or firm relationship. So, for example, husband has it, but if it's a firm relationship that a member of an LLC that has a sub-LLC that owns the property, you probably need to disclose that.
Okay, so not if we have a relationship with, not like somebody just uses us for years and years.
I don't think so. Okay. What I would tell you is that my opinion on this really doesn't matter. You need to contact the real estate division because they're the ones who are going to be controlling.
What if it's a bank that also has like a broker's license in a different state?
Again, that one would be one I would, because my opinion is my opinion. You really want to probably reach out to the real estate division and get theirs because they're the ones who enforce this.
It depends on who answers the phone at their real estate division. Experience.
Well, if this is a common issue, I'd be more than happy to reach out to the real estate division and see if they're willing to comment. Okay? Okay?
Compliance department might be.
Okay. All right. Any other questions on this? All right. Well, we've got two more things to talk about, and then I'll let you go or answer questions. Yes, ma'am.
On page 9, you did add the time.
Oh, yes, you're right. So when their buyer's acknowledgement of offer, the buyer's signature, we did put a date and a timestamp there as well. Okay? Okay, so let's talk about the other two documents that are coming out in relationship with the RPA. And the reason why we brought the RPA out first is there's a lot of changes to this document. There's a lot to digest. And I like to think of the last two documents as a very lovely after dinner mint that you're going to have no problems with. Okay? So the first one is the earnest money receipt. In your existing RPA, it's in this weird spot. It's actually before the parties have actually executed the contract. Some lenders were requiring parties to execute the earnest money receipt when they actually didn't get money or anything to require a receipt. So all we did was take the language from your existing RPA and put it in a separate document and added the broker's information that the CFPB wants. That's it. So the idea behind that was the only time you're ever going to need that receipt, what's your name? Ivan, is when I roll into Ivan's office with a gigantic gym bag full of $100 bills that may or may not be ink stained and say, will you please take this over to title for me? That's when you'd want to do that. Or I come in with like 30 bars of gold and say, here's my earnest money deposit, take this over to title. That's when you would execute the receipt. Okay? It isn't when it's being wired directly to the title company. Okay? And the other thing was we also didn't want to get you in trouble with the real estate division because you're essentially stating, I got these funds, and I can see the real estate division saying, what did you do with these funds? And you really didn't have them. So we spun it off as a separate document, okay? The second one, we talked about this before, is the buyer's response to the home inspection. So this document is now known as the request for repairs. It's a little more neutral so that you can use it to request repairs for any type of inspection, report, anything that would require you to request repairs. We also included some language in the document. In that document, the buyer says, I acknowledge that all my dates, timelines, and obligations under the purchase agreement are still controlling. So they don't have this misconception that we sent repairs over and my due diligence date is somehow told. Okay? And then the other thing we did with the document, now these will all be available for you to look at before October 1st. The other thing we did is at the bottom of the buyer's request for repairs, it had a request for an extension of time, but it had an automatic 3 days in there, which didn't make sense to me because if you needed to extend it 9 days, would you either have to strike it or do it 3 times in a row? So we gave you a blank there, so you could actually say, look, we're going to need 15 days. You could just do it at once, okay? So that's the other two changes along with the RPA. But the RPA is the big one. So going forward, both of these documents, the guide and the actual RPA with the sample on it, the reason why it's got sample written all over it is we don't want people to start using it until October 1st. We want to make sure that everybody understands it, it knows what's going on before it goes live. So it's marked sample. You can't even fill in anything in transaction desk. We had them lock them all out. So it's available for you to take to your agents along with the guide and walk through all of these changes. That's available. You're welcome to take the forms with you. On October 1st, the old RPA will go away and the new one will go live. The question always comes is, well, what happens in the transition? I'm not suggesting that you need to counter offer on October 1st at 12:55 a.m. Please use new RPA. You could, but I don't think it's necessary. But by like October 10th or 15th, you may want to consider that because we do really believe that this is a better document. It's more efficient, it's cleaner, and I think it provides protections for both the buyer and the seller that's not available in the existing document. Now that being said, it is a living document, and I would love feedback on things that work and don't work. One of the things I love about working for the association is I love the passion of you people out there trying to make our community a better place, trying to find people a home where they'll raise their kids and do all those great things. So passion is okay. Road rage is not, okay? All right, any more questions for me? Yes, ma'am.
For the repayment addendum, Is it possible that it could list, like, these are mandated by the lender for the appraisal? Then another one is an inspection and possibly be ranked in their preferences. So my client is a seller and can only pay $1,500 towards repairs. We know which ones the buyer prefers, opposed to which one's easiest for my handyman.
So what we did was we really tried to make it generic. So basically, we request repairs. We gave you a few lines to write them in, or we also gave you the ability to mark "See attached," and then had you identify the repairs. So if you want to do that as a practitioner, you're free to do that. The Forms Committee didn't feel that that was necessary. If that is a general consensus of something that might be helpful, I'm more than happy to take it to the Forms Committee to look at maybe updating the form.
So it doesn't distinguish between what is actually lender required?
Well, you could certainly do that in your request for in the attachment.
If I represent the seller and I get 15 items, I would first and foremost want to spend my resources on whatever the lender's requiring and then go down their list. And so I would just want a way of distinguishing exactly what is contingent upon the deal closing opposed to like what they would prefer.
Tell you what, when we're done, come find me. I'll give you my email address. Why don't you type all this up and I'll convey it to the Forms Committee for consideration. Okay? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm just going to ask for your email address.
My email address actually is dsanders@glvr.org. dsanders@glvr.org. My phone number is 702, this is a joke, 837-5609. Actually, if you call, I'll be honest with you, I'm not in the office very often, and my voicemail is rather lengthy. I tell you that I won't give you legal advice, and I give you the phone number for the legal hotline, and I tell you I'm not your attorney, and I give you the State Bar's number. The best way really to get a hold of me, particularly with questions like this, is via email, so that I can give you a response. If you get my voicemail, it's going to be a little bit longer in a response time.
And remember, he has caller ID.
That means I don't take Norma Jean's phone calls and she's angry. Yes, ma'am.
Because this is a new process that we're embarking on, is there going to be, and you said you wanted feedback for passion, is there going to be a uniform place that we can email concerns, have our agents go to that email, or how is the method of communication?
That's a very good question. So, and I'll be honest with you, what we've decided to do is defer to you as the broker. We want you, I don't want agents popping in my office and asking me the question and then showing it to be your office and saying, I went and talked to Sanders and you're wrong. So what I usually do when people pop into my office and ask a question, I say, you really need to go ask your broker. And if I know who the broker is, I give them a call and say, this is headed your way. So I'd much rather, that's why we did this training with the brokers first and not the agents and anybody else, so we can empower you with the questions. Now, if you don't know the answers and you want to reach out either to the legal hotline with NBAR, they're familiar with the new form as well, or myself. The problem with me is I don't give legal advice. So I can answer the question about the form, but if you want like, in 6 months from now, this isn't working in this scenario, I'm probably going to defer you up to the state hotline that has a legal line that does answer the questions. So we wanted to empower you. We want your agents to realize that you're the first resource they should go to. Okay? All right. Well, I don't have anything else, so thank you. Enjoy your 3-day weekend.